In early 1962, the United States faced a dangerously serious problem. They wanted to overthrow Fidel Castro, but they did not have enough justification to attack Cuba. Then a secret document emerged. It was not merely an invasion plan. It proposed a series of false attacks against the American people themselves. Planes could be hijacked, ships could be blown up, even the deaths of American citizens could be exploited. Everything could be made to look like Cuba was responsible. And this is not an internet story. The document really existed. Today, we are going to uncover Operation Northwoods, who designed it, why the plan was considered plausible, and why a secret proposal nearly opened the door to a much larger war.
To understand Northwoods, we have to go back to Cuba. The year was 1959. Fidel Castro successfully overthrew the government of Fulgencio Batista. At first, Castro's relationship with Washington was not entirely hostile, but the situation changed very quickly. Cuba's new government began taking over various assets. Economic relations with the United States deteriorated. Pressure from Washington increased. Castro then moved increasingly closer to the Soviet Union, and for the United States, Cuba's location was a major problem. The island was only about 150 kilometers from Florida. Now imagine a country aligned with America's main enemy standing that close. To Washington, this was no longer just a foreign revolution. It had become a national security issue. So the CIA began developing various ways to overthrow Castro. But there was one problem. How could the United States bring down the Cuban government without appearing to be the side that started a war? That question would lead Washington toward one of the most controversial proposals in Cold War history.
Cuba had long maintained close ties with the United States. The Cuban economy depended heavily on the American market. American companies held major interests on the island. But Castro's revolution changed everything. The new government began nationalizing industries. Assets belonging to foreign companies were seized. Washington responded with economic pressure. That pressure then pushed Cuba even closer to Moscow. Because one action led to the next, America applied pressure. Cuba sought protection. The Soviet Union saw an opportunity, and the relationship between the three countries became a geopolitical game. Castro was no longer merely the leader of the Cuban Revolution. He was becoming a symbol of Soviet influence in the Western Hemisphere. For the administration of President John F. Kennedy, the situation could not simply be ignored. Castro had to go. But overthrowing a foreign leader was not as simple as sending in troops. The United States needed political support. It needed a justification, and it needed a way to make action against Cuba appear legitimate. As a result, covert operations began to take shape. One of them would end in a major failure.
April 1961. A CIA-backed force of Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs. The plan sounded simple. They would enter Cuba, they would trigger an uprising, the Castro government would collapse. But reality was far worse. The invasion failed. Castro's forces managed to hold their positions. The support that had been expected did not arrive as planned. The invading force was eventually trapped. Many were killed, thousands more were captured, and the Kennedy administration suffered a serious political blow. The failure created a new problem. Castro now knew that the United States wanted to overthrow him. The Soviet Union also saw an opportunity to strengthen its relationship with Cuba. Washington became increasingly frustrated. Kennedy did not want to repeat the same failure, but the pressure to act continued to grow. So, American officials began searching for a different approach, not simply attacking Cuba, but creating conditions that would make an attack on Cuba appear necessary. And this was where Operation Northwoods began to emerge.
In early 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff prepared a document. Its title concerned possible actions to provoke a military response against Cuba. The document later became known as Operation Northwoods. This was not a document created by some anonymous secret agent. It came from the highest levels of the American military establishment. One of its key figures was General Lyman Lemnitzer. At the time, he served as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The document was then presented to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. Its broader objective was clear: create a justification that the United States could use to take military action against Cuba. But how? This was where the proposal became increasingly extreme. The planners were not discussing propaganda alone. They were discussing real incidents that could make the American people believe Cuba had attacked them. Because if the American public became angry, political pressure on the government would change. And if political pressure changed, military action would become easier to carry out. That was the logic behind Northwoods. Not winning a war on the battlefield, but winning the war before the war began.
One idea involved an aircraft. Imagine an American civilian plane. The plane would appear to have been hijacked. If it crashed or disappeared, Cuba could be blamed. But the proposal even discussed the possibility of using a substitute aircraft. One plane could be made to look like another. Then an incident could be staged. The goal was not simply to destroy an aircraft. The goal was to create a story that Cuba had attacked the United States. There were also ideas involving false attacks near American bases. This included the possibility of creating an incident at Guantanamo. The planners discussed various scenarios that could make American military activity appear to be a response to a Cuban attack. That is why the most important part of Northwoods was not any single plan. It was the pattern of thinking behind it. Create an incident, plant evidence pointing toward Cuba, let the public see Cuba as the aggressor, then use that anger as a reason to act. But there was a major problem. All of this required an extremely complicated lie. The more people involved, the greater the risk of a leak. And the larger the incident, the harder it would be to control the consequences. Imagine that a plane actually crashes, people really die, their families truly grieve, the media begins chasing the story, Congress demands action, the president comes under pressure, Cuba denies everything, the Soviet Union gets involved. Now, a covert operation has become an international crisis, and an international crisis can turn into war.
This is the part of the Northwoods story that is often left out. The United States and the Soviet Union were not playing an ordinary game. Both possessed nuclear weapons. Both had massive military forces. Both also lived in fear of a surprise attack. Because of that, a small incident could have extraordinary consequences. If the United States believed Cuba had attacked, America might respond. If the Soviet Union interpreted that response as preparation for an invasion, the Soviets might respond in turn. Each response would then create another response. One mistake could become a spiral, and Cuba was right in the middle of it. Worse still, Cuba had ties to the Soviet Union, so an attack on Cuba would not necessarily stop in Cuba. Washington knew the risks. Moscow knew the risks too. Yet political pressure continued pushing planners to search for new options. That is why Northwoods matters so much. It shows how far some officials were willing to think when searching for a reason to go to war. But one person had the power to stop it all: President Kennedy. The Northwoods proposal eventually reached the highest levels of government, but it never became an operation. Kennedy did not approve its implementation, and General Lemnitzer later did not continue as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff after his term ended. What is important to understand is this: there is no evidence that Operation Northwoods was ever carried out.
There is no evidence that the proposed false attacks were actually conducted under this plan. In fact that the proposal was rejected makes the story even more compelling, because it allows us to see the boundary between an idea and an action. A plan can emerge, a plan can be written down, a plan can even reach the highest officials, but someone still has to say no. And in the case of Northwoods, the proposal never became reality. However, the threat to Cuba was not over, because several months later, the world entered one of the most dangerous crises in modern history.
October 1962. American reconnaissance aircraft discovered Soviet missiles in Cuba. Now Washington's fears had become real. Soviet nuclear weapons were positioned dangerously close to American territory. Kennedy faced a horrifying choice. If the United States attacked Cuba, the Soviet Union might retaliate. If America did nothing, the Soviet missiles would remain there. In the end, the United States chose a naval blockade. Soviet ships moved toward Cuba. American warships waited. The world held its breath. For several days, the possibility of nuclear war became terrifyingly real. And this is where Northwoods takes on an even more frightening context. Imagine if one of the false operations in the proposal had actually taken place several months earlier. Imagine if the United States already had an incident it believed was a Cuban attack. Then the Soviet missiles were discovered. The political pressure could have been far greater. Military action could have become much harder to control. We cannot say that Northwoods would automatically have caused nuclear war. That would be speculation. But we can say something simpler. In 1962, there was almost no room for error, almost none. One misperception could have led the world toward destruction. So how did the world learn about Northwoods? Not because the operation failed, not because an agent leaked it at the time. The document remained in government archives for decades. Then, after American government documents were declassified, the proposal finally became known to the public. The document became part of the historical record, and that is where we find something extremely important: written evidence. The names of officials, dates, the structure of the proposal, everything can be examined. But this is precisely where we must be careful. Northwoods is often used as evidence for much broader claims. Some people later argued that the United States must have carried out various other false flag attacks, but the Northwoods document itself does not prove all of that. What it proves is something more specific. American military officials did propose scenarios designed to provoke action against Cuba, and the proposal was not carried out. The difference between those two things is extremely important, because history is not about making a story sound more extreme. History is about following the evidence. Northwoods reveals something larger than just the story of Cuba. It shows how governments make decisions under pressure. When a government becomes convinced that an enemy poses a major threat, the boundary between defense and provocation can become blurred. When public opinion becomes part of warfare, information turns into a weapon. And when a country possesses extraordinary military power, the ability to create a narrative can be just as important as the ability to fire a missile. Northwoods also reveals something about human beings. The planners were not living in a world without rules. They were living in fear. They saw the Soviet Union as an existential threat. They saw Castro as a gateway through which the enemy could enter American territory. Under those conditions, extreme actions can begin to look rational. That is the most frightening part. Not that a secret document was ever written, but that people living in fear could begin to see extreme actions as reasonable solutions.
More than 60 years later, the world has changed. The Soviet Union has collapsed. The Cold War has ended. Cuba still exists. The United States remains a global power. But one thing has not changed. War still requires a narrative. A government needs to explain to its people why they must go to war. The enemy must appear to be a threat. An incident must have meaning, and the public must believe that a particular action is truly necessary. Technology has only changed the speed. In the past, propaganda spread through television and newspapers. Now, information can travel across the world in seconds. Photos can be fabricated. Videos can be manipulated. Claims can go viral before the facts have time to be checked. That is why the story of Operation Northwoods is not only a story about Cuba. It is a story about power, about fear, about how a government can imagine creating a political reality. But it is also about how a plan can be stopped before it becomes reality. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. History is not always determined by what ultimately happens. Sometimes history is also shaped by what almost happened. In 1962, a document proposed ways to create a war. Aircraft, explosions, deaths, an enemy made to look guilty. But the plan was never carried out. And because of that, we can discuss it today as history. Not as the beginning of a war, not as the beginning of a catastrophe, but as a warning. Because in international politics, sometimes the most dangerous thing is not the weapon that is fired. It is the story that makes someone feel they have no choice but to fire it.